All right, so welcome to week 7 of Communicating Science to Solve Tough Challenges. This week, we are talking about telling a science story. Just wanted to make sure that it's showing the proper thing. Okay, so last time we talked about the problems created by using too much jargon in science. We discussed the use of similes, metaphors, and analogies as ways to de-jargonify science. We talked about the importance of creativity and practice to improve SciComm skills and limit jargon. So today we're going to talk about actually telling science stories. So did you know the human brain is wired for storytelling? Stories make science more accessible, relatable, and impactful, often over generations. Stories involving scientists, of which there are many, are often told in a dry and personal manner, just talking about all their different accomplishments, but that's not what makes stories good. A good story has a human aspect, it's relatable, it's interesting. So there are many story frameworks. We'll discuss a couple here, but you're always welcome to use your own frameworks and narratives. So how to tell a science story. I've heard this a lot. Telling a story or writing something, it's like getting from point A to point B, but not literally, because you're not literally driving someone, but you're taking them on a mental journey kind of. So start with your goal in mind. What's the goal of telling your story? Well, if you're telling a story about a scientist, like let's say Katalin Karikó, her life story is really interesting because you could say, yes, Katalin Karikó developed mRNA vaccine technology, but that's not the part that makes the story interesting is all of the obstacles that she faced and all the sexism, and she got demoted from University of Pennsylvania, and then she went to work at BioNTech, but she never gave up. So what is the goal of telling the story? So sometimes, if for me, what really resonates with me about Katalin Karikó's life story is the fact that she persevered so much, and I find that very relatable, especially as a woman in science. So if you think about who your audience is, like, is your audience young women that might be interested in science? Avoid jargon and data dumps. Remember that you're optimizing your storytelling for the human brain. Make your story personal. Share personal, relatable struggles. Like you could say this person um, did a bunch of genetics. Like I've read so many stories of scientists that they kind of all blurred together in my mind. But one thing that I've always remembered about those stories is the struggles they faced, and the fact that they loved science so much they sacrificed things or they went against society, especially for women, because women face a lot of pressure to, and actually, like in Europe, in different places, women couldn't even get a science degree prior to, let's say, like 1900s or something. I forget exactly, but like women couldn't even enroll in college. So how does a woman become a scientist in that kind of environment? That's the struggle and challenge that really resonates with me as a woman in science. So think about who you're telling your story to, and then consider what they might find interesting, or try to motivate them, inspire hope. Because another thing about telling a science story is there's a lot of science stories that aren't told, and maybe part of the reason they're not told is because scientists don't know how to tell them in a way that resonates with people. Or if you gave scientists the storytelling skills and you're like, hey, here's some skills you can use to tell stories, maybe a scientist would be telling more stories. So practice, we'll get more into detail about different storytelling frameworks, but practice telling your story out loud to friends and family and connect with your audience. So there's two models that I'm going to talk about today, the hero's journey model and the and but therefore model. And but there's also there's storytelling techniques that are relevant to your particular culture or one's particular culture, one's particular audience. In journalism, we say the main point in the beginning. However, as we talked to Oswald Moyo, and he told us he lives in Africa. In indigenous Africa, he studies indigenous African science communication, basically. He's told me that in indigenous African cultures, the main point might be located at the end of a story. Like, for example, like a fable, like the fable of the dog that had a bone, and then he looked in the river and he saw a reflection of a dog with a bone. So he tried to get the bone from the dog, but it was actually his own reflection. So the moral of the story is don't get too greedy. So like that kind of thing. Aesop's fables are some of my favorite stories. I don't know if you've heard of them, but you can borrow, like if you have like a favorite story that you had when you were a kid, you can borrow the storytelling technique and tell stories that way. And it's kind of a weird mishmash, but you know what? If that's how stories are told, scientists need to be experts at telling stories just as well as any other storyteller, because science is a story. So let's talk about the hero's journey of storytelling. Um, I have no idea where I found this. Um, maybe I don't know. I'll have to try to see where I got this, but um, the ordinary world. So we have the ordinary world, introduce the protagonist, and then I'm pretty sure I got this off of Google somewhere. Introduce the protagonist in their normal everyday life. So the hero's journey is about the hero. The main person is, I'll try to find where I got this from and put that in the description box because I don't know why I didn't include the reference here. But the hero goes on a journey. There's many heroes. Like if you study epics, there's like Odysseus. There's in Persian culture, we have the Shahnameh. We have other heroes' journeys like Hercules. Different heroes, they go on an adventure. They so the hero does. They start out. They're just themselves. They're just a guy or a girl or whatever, and they're living their normal everyday life. And then they get called to adventure. And then maybe they initially refuse the call, but then they meet a mentor, like for example, the Spider-Man movies. I don't know if you guys have watched Batman versus Superman. That's one of my favorite movies, and I've watched it like a million times. But that's two different heroes because we have Batman and we have Superman, and they actually like battle each other in that movie. So heroes encounter tests. They have allies, they have enemies, they get close to achieving, like Lord of the Rings, for example, is a hero's journey because we have, I forget what the main character's name is. It's either Frodo or Bilbo Baggins. I think it's Frodo. The guy, there's a ring in Lord of the Rings, and then everyone tries to get the ring. But like if you watch the movies, there's so many trials and tribulations that they face, and sometimes they almost got it once, but then they lose it again. And so ultimately, and it's a true journey because they're really like persevering. So then they pursue their goal and in turn are changed by their goal. So it has all these different steps. You can, it doesn't have to follow these particular steps, but I actually spent 10 minutes putting this slide set together a few weeks ago because I knew I wouldn't have time right now. So sorry, that's so vague. But let's move on to the and but therefore model of storytelling. And establishes the, so and but therefore is storytelling in which you talk about something and something else, but something, therefore such and such. So if I wanted to tell my story of my science research, I could say, like if I want to talk about my research when I was a research assistant, I studied the brain under, I helped work on a study about alcoholism. And I also gave alcoholic drinks to people, non-alcoholics, to help figure out what the brain does under acute alcohol intoxication. And then, therefore, I discovered that the brain, whenever you drink, it reduces your inhibitions. And over time, when you drink alcohol, it also affects your brain and creates changes, especially if you drink too much. And as an alcoholic, that's really bad for your brain because alcohol is a very small molecule and it passes the blood-brain barrier. So, or you could tell like a different story, like you could sort of meld it with the hero's journey and is like the everyday, like I'm a scientist and I'm a writer, but I don't feel like I fit in either of those worlds because there are so few scientist writers. Therefore, I'm carving out a new path for myself as a neuroscientist writer. So there's some more details on the slide about like how exactly to use those, but I think those examples prove a better point than the words on the slide. So that's all we actually had for today. So let me stop recording and then we can go to the discussion.